Hi, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, this is a space where I share practical tools and honest reflections to help millennial and Gen Z adults build better lives one intentional decision at a time. And today I want to talk about our budgets and how to fix them so that they start working for us instead of just being a nice idea on paper. So you've been budgeting for some time now, but something's not working. It seems like something always comes up, and either you find yourself justifying it as a one time thing, or potentially worse, it's an actual emergency and you have no choice but to take the hit. The latter can feel especially stressful and can potentially be incredibly damaging to our finances. And unfortunately, it's a lot more common than you might think. According to US Federal Reserve data collected over the past 10 years, the majority of American households would be unable to handle a $400 unexpected expense without going into debt. And that's a sobering reality. But the good news is it doesn't have to be your reality. Budgets are a great way to start becoming financially savvy, but the best budgets have implementation systems to help turn them into actual, tangible results. And sinking funds are one of the simplest implementation systems to get started with. Just having a few in place can stop an unexpected expense from becoming a financial crisis and can over time even create breathing room for you to start using your money to actually enjoy your life, which is kind of the point. And I'm speaking from experience here. Quick story time. A few years into our marriage, my husband and I took a trip to one of our favorite local places. And, we were a few years into our careers and felt we had really earned the right to enjoy ourselves for a little bit. Unfortunately, it was one of the most stressful vacations I've ever been on because after a while, each credit card swipe raised my anxiety levels just a little bit more. And every additional purchase came with a little hint of guilt because it just, it began to feel a little bit too spontaneous for my liking. Fortunately, when we got home and had a chance to look at our credit card statements, we actually found that the damage wasn't nearly as bad as we'd expected. But thinking that it had been for that entire week that we were gone put a cloud on the entire experience. And the worst part is it was entirely self-inflicted. Now, fast forward a few years later to a situation that wasn't actually our fault. Last year, we had to take our car in for some routine checkups, and we got hit unexpectedly with a $1,000 car repair bill. Now, was I annoyed? Yes, and also mildly frustrated. But did I lose sleep? Not a wink. So what changed? Granted, our income had increased over those few years, but the bigger piece was we had started implementing better systems long before those increases took place. And one of those systems was, you guessed it, sinking funds. With that said, let's talk about what sinking funds are, why they're worth having, and some simple ways to get started. A sinking fund is simply money that you set aside regularly for some known future expense so that by the time you get to said future expense, the money is already waiting for you. Some sinking funds are for expenses that you know for sure are coming, like Christmas, birthdays, vacations, tuition, annual insurance premiums. Others are for expenses that you know will come up eventually, but you're not entirely sure about the timeline. So think general emergencies, car repairs, home maintenance, and medical expenses. Either way, the idea is the same. You set aside money now so that by the time you get there, the money is already available for you to use for said purpose. So hopefully by now you've begun to appreciate why sinking funds might be a good idea to start implementing in your budgeting system, but just in case you still need some convincing, here are some reasons why you should definitely think about implementing them. The first and honestly biggest reason is that they give incredible peace of mind. When you have money set aside for some future expense that may happen, it completely changes the experience. I mentioned earlier how we got hit with that $1,000 car repair bill, and while it was frustrating, it wasn't a crisis. Money was already waiting there for its purpose. Second is that they reduce decision fatigue. I'm sure you've had this experience that when an unexpected expense comes up, you find yourself doing all kinds of mental gymnastics to figure out a way to make it work. So maybe you find yourself asking questions like, can I afford this? Should I put it on my credit card? Is it part of my budget? Should I do it now or later? With sinking funds, many of those decisions have already been made, so you don't have to stress about it in the moment. Next is that they make your budget far more realistic. See, a lot of us build our budgets around ideal months and timelines when the truth is that life doesn't really work that way. In reality, cars need repairs, kids have birthdays, family events happen, emergencies come up. So sinking funds allow you to build your budget around your actual life and tendencies instead of pretending that those things don't exist. In one of my previous videos about 6 small money habits that save me thousands of dollars, I talked about how I just know from experience that Christmas is always going to be a relatively high spend season for me. I know two things about myself around Christmas. Number one, I love giving people gifts. And number two, one of those people is myself. And don't get me wrong, self control is important, and discipline plays a really, really big part in achieving our financial goals. So now, instead of letting the Christmas spirit derail my finances, I just plan for it ahead of time. And finally, sinking funds turn your budget into a real working system. And this might be the most important point. Budget is a plan, and sinking funds are an implementation tool, which means they help turn your budget from a nice idea on paper to a living, breathing system that actually produces the results you want over time. So, with that said, how do you actually get started with sinking funds? Let's break this down into 5 really easy steps. Step number 1 is to decide what actually needs a sinking fund. So I recommend starting with making a list of expenses that tend to disrupt your life, and then categorizing those according to what makes sense. So known versus unknown expenses, discretionary versus necessary expenses, short-term expenses versus more long-term horizon expenses, whatever makes sense for your life. And this is where you need to get really, really honest with yourself. Many of those things that tend to catch us off guard financially weren't really surprises. They were actually predictable things that we just failed to plan properly for. Personally, I'd recommend starting with a starter emergency fund of a few $100s to $1,000 to cover small emergencies that might come up, like a car repair. A larger emergency fund that maybe has a few months worth of your necessary expenses to cover you in case of a job loss or reduced income for another reason. And then 1 or 2 additional categories that are relevant to your life. Don't feel like you have to start 10 sinking funds all at once. It's not realistic or attainable for most people, and quite honestly, it's not even necessary. For the first couple of years, my husband and I focused primarily on emergency sinking funds, and then when those numbers got to amounts that we were a bit more comfortable with, we were able to ease off a bit more and direct our financial attention to other discretionary goals. The key thing is to start small and prioritize really, really well. Step 2 is to know your numbers. Once you figure out your categories, it's time to figure out how much they will actually cost based on real life experience and also research. And I recommend getting as concrete as possible so that you can add them as realistic line items in your budget. A vacation is a really easy example. You research your flights, hotel accommodations, food, activities, anything else relevant to the trip to figure out how much it's going to cost, and then determine how much time you have between now and the trip. So, for example, let's say the trip's going to cost you $2,400 and you have 12 months before it happens. You need to save $200 per month from now until then. The goal suddenly feels a lot more manageable and tangible. It's something you can actually plug into your budget. And if it's not realistic or manageable, this is another situation where you need to get more honest with yourself. Maybe you need to reduce some of those costs, like finding cheaper flights or cutting back on some of those activities. You might have to push back your timeline a little bit so that the number does become something you actually can work with. The goal isn't to make up some number and force it into your life. It's to come up with what's actually realistic and sustainable for you over the long term so you don't get discouraged and you actually hit your goals. Step 3 is to create designated accounts. I highly recommend separating your sinking fund money from your day-to-day spending activity accounts. This helps reduce confusion and minimize the likelihood of you dipping into funds that have a designated future purpose. I've seen people do this in a lot of different ways. Some people like to create accounts for absolutely everything down to their daily coffee budget account. This might be overkill for most people, but I do think it helps to separate money based on its purpose. So, for example, maybe you have one account for operating income and monthly bills, another account for emergencies, third account for necessary future expenses like car maintenance and insurance premiums, and a final fourth discretionary goals account. One thing to be mindful of, though, regardless of what structure you choose or how many accounts you create, is fees. Some accounts require minimum balances, others have transaction fees whenever you move money in and out of the account. And all of these fees combined can quietly eat away at your savings. So it's really important to do your research and open up the right kind of accounts for your situation. My husband and I use high yield savings accounts for our emergency funds because that money tends to sit untouched for long periods of time and actually has a chance to gather interest. But for everything else, we're pretty much sticking with low fee, low maintenance, checking accounts to give us as much flexibility as possible. Step number 4 is where the fun starts, and that is to fund the account. And if I could give one piece of advice here, it would be to automate as much as humanly possible. So once you've calculated how much you need to save, set up automatic transfers to do the hard part for you. This doesn't necessarily work for everybody, but I've just found that the less I rely on memory and motivation, the more successful I'll be long term. Also, if possible, consider jumpstarting some of those more critical savings goals with a lump sum. So, for example, if you're trying to get an emergency fund going, you might want to consider using your next tax refund or cash bonus or whatever extra money you can come up with to get it started, and then use automatic transfers to keep growing it over time. Final step is to track and review. It's really important to make sure that you have a system for tracking what's going in, what's coming out, and what your balances should be on some kind of a regular basis, maybe weekly or monthly, whatever cadence works for you. As I mentioned in one of my earlier videos about how my husband and I lost track of our finances after having a baby, one of the things that we discovered after we had a chance to finally go through our numbers postpartum was that transfers that we set up months ago stopped for some reason, which meant that we were dipping into our sinking funds a lot faster than we expected to. That's why tracking is so important. And it doesn't have to be complicated. For us, we just have a spreadsheet that tracks our contributions, balances, transfer start dates, and stop dates. The goal is never perfection, it's consistent visibility. Okay, final recap. A lot of emergencies aren't true emergencies. They're actually predictable situations that we just fail to plan properly for. And while budgets are important, we need to make sure we have implementation systems that help turn those plans into a reality. Sinking funds are one of those implementation systems. They help reduce stress, they create clarity, they help turn a budget from a nice idea on paper to a living, breathing reality that actually works. And most importantly, they make it much easier to sleep at night knowing that you have guardrails in place to keep you on track, even when life throws curveballs your way. Because while we can't predict everything, we can prepare for a lot more than we think. I hope you found this video helpful, and if so, please be sure to like and subscribe for more systems and principles that can help you build a better life, one intentional decision at a time. And let me know in the comments, what are your current sinking fund goals? Do you currently have any in place? And if not, what are some steps you're planning on taking to get started? As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!